This is Matt Dean with A+ College Ready, and today we're going to talk about population growth. We're going to start by discussing exponential growth. Exponential growth is growth whose rate becomes ever more rapid in proportion to an increasing population number. During this whole discussion, we're going to use the letter N to indicate the population size or the population number. This kind of growth tends to occur in populations that have plenty of resources. They have an abundant supply of food, water, space, nesting areas, and so on. In exponential growth, the change in the population size can be symbolized as dn over dt. I want you to think of this d as a delta, and that's saying the change in population size equals or over the change in time. So your formula sheet, your AP Biology formula sheet is going to write it this way. For some of you, it might be a little bit less confusing to think of it like that. We can calculate the change in population size using this equation, which is also found on your AP formula sheet. Notice that you've got R max. Sometimes you'll see that just written as R times N. R max is the growth rate per individual. We're going to call it the per capita growth rate. The growth rate per individual in the population. To calculate that value, the R max, the per capita growth rate, you simply take the number of births minus the number of deaths, and you divide that all by the total population size. During exponential growth, R max is constant, regardless of the population size. When exponential growth happens, we're going to see, if we were graphing it as a population size, graphed against time, our growth curve is going to look sort of like a J. And you can see during this whole curve, the slope is increasing. Therefore, the rate of change of population size is always changing. It's always increasing, might be a better way to think of it. Exponential growth in the real world is not really sustainable because there's a finite amount of materials. Eventually, food supplies start to run out, water starts to run out, space starts to run out, and the population can't continue to grow forever. So here's a more cleaned up population growth curve, an exponential population growth curve. And again, note it's got that characteristic J shape. Let's also talk about logistic growth. This is a type of growth whose rate decreases as the population size starts to approach the carrying capacity. We're going to use the letter K to represent carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is essentially the maximum number of organisms that an environment can sustain. It's determined by things such as the amount of available space, the amount of available food and water, and so on. The change in the population size in this kind of scenario can be found, again, using dn over dt. Change in population size over time equals R, and again, that's the growth rate, times N. But this time we're also going to multiply it by this factor, K minus N all over K. And if you pay attention to this bullet right here, that K minus N over K term is essentially the fraction of the carrying capacity that has not yet been used up. The bigger N gets, the more of that gets used up. So the more carrying capacity that has been used up, the more the K minus N over K term will reduce the growth rate. Because again, as N goes up, the top value of this fraction is going to go down, and we're going to be multiplying N by some fraction. And the bigger N gets, the smaller and smaller this fraction gets. So as the population gets bigger and bigger, the R max gets smaller and smaller in logistic growth. So again, during logistic growth, R max decreases as the size of the population increases. Our logistic growth curves are going to have sort of a characteristic S shape, and we'll see that in a second. Another thing to think about with logistic growth, when the population is really, really small, N is very small compared to K. And therefore, K minus N over K is pretty much R max times N. We could think of when the population is small, this term is very close to being 1. And therefore, the population growth, the change in population size, is essentially the same as it would be in exponential growth. But as N increases, this term becomes smaller and smaller, and therefore the per capita growth rate also becomes smaller and smaller. Here's a logistic growth curve. Again, it's got sort of an S shape to it. Notice we're going to talk about 4 phases that happen during logistic growth. We're also going to notice that once the population size gets up to about this level right here, that it tends to oscillate around that. Whatever that value is right in there, that's the carrying capacity. And once the population size reaches the carrying capacity, in most cases, it's going to stay pretty close to that value. When we're talking about the stages of a logistic growth curve, we're going to talk about the lag phase, the exponential growth phase, the deceleration phase, and the stable equilibrium phase. So let's talk just a moment about each one of those. So during the lag phase, and again notice during the lag phase, it's called lag because the population growth is not happening very fast there. So the lag phase is the period of time immediately after a new population is established. For a while, the population remains small and pretty constant in terms of size. At that point, both natality, which is birth, and mortality, which is death, both of those rates are pretty low. The lag phase occurs because reproduction doesn't happen instantaneously. Once the new organisms move into this new environment, they have to mate. It takes time for the young to be born. And depending on the kind of organism, that could take a very long time. Then we've got exponential growth. Right in there. Notice that the slope of the whole curve is highest during the exponential growth phase. So the exponential growth phase is the period of time when a population is growing rapidly. Exponential growth results in a population increasing by the same percentage every year because during that exponential growth stage, R max is essentially constant. The deceleration phase is the next one. And notice that during that deceleration phase, the slope of our line begins to decrease a bit. That means the rate of growth, or the rate of population growth, is starting to decrease. So again, during the deceleration phase, the population growth rate begins to slow. The number entering the population by reproduction remains pretty high, but some start to die. And therefore, the population growth rate starts to slow down. The size of the population continues to get bigger. We're not talking about a decreasing population. Just the rate at which the population size is increasing is slowing down. Finally, we get to the stable equilibrium phase. That's this. At the stable equilibrium phase, the population stops growing and it stays steady, somewhere near the carrying capacity typically. And that's essentially because the birth rate, the natality, is equal to the death rate, the mortality at that point. Now we're going to look at a couple of calculations. Starting out here, we have a population of dandelions, little plants. They have a 1-year reproductive cycle. And we've got the following data. So we're starting off with 1,000 plants in our population. During this year, there's 200 new seedlings and 40 of the original plants died. So first of all, we want to know the number of births. Well, for plants, new seedlings are births. So that's just 200. We also want to know the number of deaths. Well, the problem tells us that 40 plants died during that first year. So we're just going to pencil in 40. Now the per capita birth rate. Remember, that's the birth rate per individual. To calculate that, we had 200 births out of the total population size of 1,000. So if we divide that out, our per capita growth rate is 0.2. And I'm going to write it as 0.20. Our per capita death rate, we're going to calculate the same way. We had 40 deaths out of a total population size of 1,000. So we divide that out and we get 0.04 as our death rate. Our per capita growth rate we can find in one of two ways. We can subtract the birth rate from the death rate. 0.2 minus 0.04 would give us 0.16. Or we could take the change in the population size. So there were 200 new births. There were 40 deaths. That means we got 160 new individuals out of a total original population size of 1,000. So that gives us 0.16 as our R max, or reproductive rate. All right, so next, assume the population of dandelions is undergoing exponential growth at the rate of R max. Calculate the number of dandelions found in the population over 6 generations and record your calculations in Table 3. So at time 0, generation 0, we started with 1,000 individuals. To calculate the size after 1 generation, which is one year, we're going to use our equation dn over dt equals R max times n. Now remember that R max is 0.16 and that n was our original population size, 1,000. So 1,000 times 0.16 is 160. That's how many new individuals total are added to our population. That's our change in population size over time. So we had 1,000, we added 160, which means after generation 1, we have 1,160 individuals. We repeat that same calculation for the next generation. So again, we'll take R max of 0.16, this time times our new population size, which is 1,160. All right, so this time we'll go 0.16 times 1160, and that gives us 185.6. Well, we can't get 0.6 individuals, so I'm going to round that off to 186. So between generation 1 and 2, our population grows by 186. So we're going to say 186 plus our generation 1 population size, which was 1160. 1160 plus 186. So after generation 2, we have 1,346 individuals. Well, we do the same calculation for generation 3. We replace our population size with 1,346. We multiply 0.16, our per capita growth rate, times 1,346. That gives us 215.36. We'll just round that off to 215. So we're going to take that 215, which is our change in population size over time, our population growth. We're going to add that to 1,346. So 215 plus 1,346. We end up with 1,561 as our new population size. Repeat that calculation for the next generation. So we'll take 0.16 times 1,561. That gives us 249.7, so we'll round that off to 250. So that's our population growth. We're going to add that to our population size after generation 3, 1,561. So 1,561 plus 250. So we're at 1,811. And then we'll do that one more time for the last generation. So this time we'll take 0.16, the per capita growth rate, times 1,861. That gives us 297.76. We'll round that to 298. That's how much our population grew during that generation. We'll take the 298 and add it to our population size, which was 1811. So we end up with a population size by the 5th generation of 2109 individuals. All right, moving on to the next problem. It says you now begin to monitor a new population of dandelions. The initial population number, N, is 60, and the dandelions have a per capita growth rate, or max, of 0.3. The field in which the dandelions grow is very small, so the carrying capacity for the population of dandelions is 80. Calculate the change in population size, dn over dt, for this group of dandelions after 1 generation. So this time we're talking about logistic growth because resources are limited. Now remember that our equation for that looks a little different than the equation for exponential growth. This is what our equation looks like. dn over dt equals r times n times the fraction k minus n all over k. So for this calculation, let's take our R max, which is 0.3, times our initial population size, which was 60, times K, the carrying capacity, which the problem told us was 80, minus the population size, 60, all over K again. And again, K is 80. So let's do the math. 0.30 times 60 times the quantity 80 minus 60 over 80. And what we end up with is 9. Let me correct myself there. If we redo the math here, 0.3 times 60 times the fraction 80 minus 60 over 80, that actually comes out to be 4.5. So let's round that off to 5. So during this 1 year time interval, our change in population number over time is 5. So we started with a population of 60. After 1 year, after 1 generation, we would have a population of 65. Question 2, which type of growth are the dandelions undergoing as N approaches K? And explain your answer. Well, this is logistic growth. As remember, during exponential growth, we're going to get a growth curve like so. That can happen as long as resources are unlimited. But as the population size starts to approach the carrying capacity, the population size will level off and it will start to oscillate around that carrying capacity. That is logistic growth. Question 3. Other than size, what other factors help to determine the carrying capacity of a specific environment? That could be things like the availability of food, the availability of water, and any kind of other environmental concerns. So we also want to talk about some growth strategies. And here we'll talk about what's called R and K selection. We're first going to talk about species called R-selected species. Remember, that R stands for growth rate. Organisms that we call R-selected species exhibit rapid population growth. These tend to be opportunistic kinds of species. They're going to move into a new open environment. They're going to invade the environment. They're going to reproduce really, really quickly. And then they're going to die. So we'll oftentimes see them at first have an exponential growth curve. And then they'll exceed what the environment can sustain. And they'll go through a die-off period. And then they may come back. And they may go through another exponential growth curve. Kind of exceed what the environment can sustain, and then they'll go through another die-off period. These organisms usually are small in size. They usually have really short life expectancies. They provide little to no parental care. Oftentimes, they're what we call pioneer species. They're the things that move into a new environment during the process of succession. They exhibit an exponential growth curve, so they get the J-shaped growth curve. And also they exhibit what's called a type 3 survivorship curve. We'll explore that on the next slide. Some examples would be bacteria, insects, maybe even fish, frogs, would all be R-selected species. So here we see what are called survivorship curves. And notice we're looking at the number of survivors graphed against essentially time. R-selected species have a type 3 curve. And notice that in these type 3 individuals, right after birth, maybe even before birth, Most of the organisms die very, very quickly. A few of them live out the whole life expectancy, but most die early in life, and that's because there's very little to no parental care. The other organisms we'll talk about here in a second, K-selected species, these are things like humans, elephants, a lot of the mammals, the bigger mammals. They provide lots of parental care. So most of their babies make it through those first few years. Most of the organisms live out most of the life expectancy. And then as they reach the life expectancy, they start to die very, very quickly. This is called a type 1 survivorship curve. And those are the ones we're going to talk the most about. The type 1, which is characteristic of our selected species, and the type 3, which is, I said that backwards. The type 1, which is characteristic of K-selected species, and the type 3, which is characteristic of our selected species. Let's go back and talk about K-selected species. K-selected species, those organisms have a population that remains at or near the carrying capacity. Okay. They tend to provide lots of parental care. They tend to maintain a stable population size over time. Usually they're larger organisms in terms of size, and they usually have long life expectancies. They exhibit logistic growth, so they get that S-shaped curve, growth curve, and they have the type 1 survivorship curve. Usually they're part of what's called the climax community. During the process of succession, the climax community is the more stable group of organisms that move into an area toward the end of its change, the end of its succession pattern. Some examples would be humans, elephants, some types of birds, organisms that tend to provide lots of parental care and exhibit that type 1 survivorship curve.